Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon-Muñiz.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Gobble, gobble. Today, we're going to be talking about family. We're going to be talking about kin. Are you my kin? That's just a question I have in my head. I swear I heard that either at a family reunion or a movie or something, but I have that voice and that phrase stuck in my head. And it's going to be stuck in there all day.
I'm really curious. I wish you knew where you heard that.
Yeah. I really think it was a family reunion. In case some of you guys who don't know, I grew up in a very rural place in Missouri, and my family reunions are a little bit of a hillbilly get-together. I say that as a hillbilly, so I feel like I can say that. I have permission.
So on the topic of family, and first want to recognize that we're talking about Thanksgiving in the U.S. But I have a friend in Canada who mentioned that some Canadians also celebrate on American Thanksgiving, which I found really interesting.
They get double Thanksgiving.
They did have double Thanksgiving, but their family does it bigger on American Thanksgiving or U.S. Thanksgiving, which I just found really interesting.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about social connections today. And we want to start off by thinking about a family unit, just because this is how a lot of times when we think of social connections, it's our default. It's the first thing we think about. I want to preface this by saying that we recognize not everyone has the same degree of connection with biological family members. And we want to take a moment to acknowledge that. And so we're going to be talking about this in the context of the MCAT and also some other connections outside of family. So don't tune out just yet. So thinking about family, we often think about this nuclear framework, right? This traditional framework of a mom, a dad, some child, recognizing that there are a lot of different families, right? And you don't have to have a child to have a family. I just want to be very clear about that, because there's still connection within this familial unit outside of just parent and child. That is another type of connection. Family, we take a broader step back and think about how it also looks different across cultures. And so what constitutes a family in, the United States may be different than in some other country, or even what is considered a family in one state in the United States versus elsewhere. So there's a lot of variability within families. And one of the types of connections that we talk about with families is related to kinship.
Yeah. So I feel like I've been so deep in the physics zone that when you say nuclear family, what comes to mind is like a family that's emitting gamma radiation. But like nuclear family is like a term of just like, mother, father generally, and then dependent children. But like you said, it looks a lot different than that sometimes. It's not always that same definition. This is kind of where kin comes in. So kin is a phrase or not a phrase, but like a term specifically talking about like people you consider family. And so there's a couple different types of kin. There is like kin by blood, where you are like genetically related. You have kin by like marriage. Like if I marry somebody, my wife would be family, right? In that case. Or adoptive scenarios as well. This goes into a lot of kind of like different ways and can start to make families very kind of confusing and branched at times. I've mentioned this before, but we do fostering in my house. And so we have some foster kids. And so definitely people I would consider to be family. But then there's another, like, we don't have like a genetic relationship. In that case, like I'm obviously not married, like there's no blood connections there. And technically we haven't adopted, like, because it's fostering. And so like, we're not technically legally the parents or that sort of thing. But there are other terms like fictive kinship, which is kinship that you would consider like someone you would consider family, but is not kind of that blood or marriage or adoptive kind of angle. It doesn't have to be like a fostering thing. It doesn't have to be like, adults, quote unquote, and dependents sort of thing. You can also have kinship with friends, but this needs to be like, I wouldn't say every friend is your kin. But if you consider them to be like family, I know there's a lot of people out there who like maybe don't have great relationships with their biological family. And so as a result, they create their own family through like friendships and groups and like coming together. And so, those of you who are out there and who are celebrating Thanksgiving just with friends that you consider to be like family, like I would say, yeah, that's kin in my mind. And that's something that definitely I'm counting it for sure.
As you should. Friendsgiving is something that I think should be encouraged more, especially I know that not everyone is able to travel home. Like, let's say that you went to school out of state or internationally, it can be really tough to travel home. So even if you are close with, your biological family or your adoptive family, getting there physically is not always feasible. Yeah. And so I know there were...
I'm just having these like thoughts of like what you're talking about is what I went through in medical school, where because I was MD PhD, like in-state, out-of-state kind of doesn't matter in that case. And so where I went to med school, all of my MD PhD friends, none of them had family in the area. Like they were all kind of like spread across the globe. And so we would do Thanksgiving together. And a lot of those people I would consider kin to this day, like people that I like have Zoom calls on weekends and I travel out and like, okay, for my birthday, what do you want to do? I want to go visit my friends or my family. I kind of consider them like family. It's a little bit weird because I feel like med school, and this is maybe something for some of you guys in the future, but I feel like med school was so hard that it kind of like forged stronger relationships as a result of that. And so there are some people that I'm very close to because I kind of was in the trenches with them in the med school battle. But yeah, so definitely there is, family doesn't mean like specifically genetically related.
Yeah. And you're hinting at something really important, and that's that the degree of relationship that we have with people differs, right? So we are going to have, generally speaking, stronger connections with our kin versus some of those friends that we're not quite as much in the trenches with. And so the people that we have connections to in general make up what we need to know, for the MCAT as our social network. These are the people that we have connections to, right? Regardless of the strength. And when you're thinking about social network theory, there are two main terms that you need to be familiar with, and those are the nodes and the ties. So each person is going to represent a node. So in your social network, you are the node, you can put yourself in the middle, and then you have ties or connections to other people. And so if you're drawing this out, you can picture yourself as a circle, and then your friends as other circles around you, and those lines are going to represent ties and the connections that you have with them. And so what's interesting is that you can have a situation where you have a friend that none of your other friends are connected to, or you can have friends that know each other and are connected to each other. And so these social networks and the way we map them out can be either very simple or super complex, especially if you start taking into account who knows who, right? Yeah. I was taking a class during the fall, I'll say, on sociology, and our professor, really interesting, really smart, well-renowned individual, he talked about social networks and he gave us a term called gossip seeds. And I know gossip makes people immediately have a gut reaction like, oh, it's bad. Doesn't necessarily have to be. A gossip seed doesn't have to be. So a gossip seed is basically someone who has a ton of these ties, a ton of these connections. And again, doesn't have to be super strong connections. You can think about this as the popular kids in high school or the people who seem to know everybody on campus and are involved in like 20 different extracurricular clubs. If you're pre-med and involved in that many extracurricular clubs, more power to you. I don't know how you do it. But these people, because they have so many connections, you give them a piece of information and it can spread like wildfire. Right. And so you can think about how this has implications as a future physician. You want to think about, okay, is my patient perhaps, and you're not actively thinking this, but you will subconsciously after this podcast episode, could my patient be a gossip seed? And I give them information, and then that impacts how other people view medicine or how they view this topic, right? And so giving information to everyone and good quality information to these gossip seeds can help spread that information a lot faster. And there are studies on this, which I find really interesting. I find sociology in general really interesting, but it's a cool topic, cool term too.
Yeah, I really like that idea of like that, like understanding that is like, oh, like this patient I have is really active in this community.
Yeah.
And so by reaching out and like getting information to that person, I can impact that community.
Mm-hmm.
One of my best friends from from med school, he did a lot of research specifically on healthcare in the Amish community, because they're very insulated, and so they did not often go and like get like vaccines, and they like were generally like sometimes unconnected from the bigger news of the world and kind of like what was going on. And so specifically, he did a lot of research with them. Honestly, this was before COVID, and I'm like, I can't imagine how useful that information could have been for that sort of scenario.
Yeah.
But they were identifying that there are certain community members that if you can reach them, it can reach the rest of the community. And so like being able to save multiple lives by having this sort of like connection or a stronger connection is something that can be really useful.
And it's something that was, and to your point, right? COVID showed how important this was, especially when you think about communities that have historically been, gotten the bad end of the stick, the short end of the stick with medicine. That trust wasn't always there, right? And you think about communities that were more hesitant to adopt things like vaccination. The way, we recently had a speaker in school, and they talked about how when they were working with the homeless population in the city and getting them vaccinated, them knowing who was coming in and having that familiarity and being able to talk amongst each other was what allowed them to be able to get this very vulnerable group vaccinated. And a lot of connections were made between medical communities and religious leaders in a community, because you can think about how they're going to be a trusted gossip seed, right? Because they are going to have a lot of connections within the community. They're seen as trustworthy. We need to do a whole episode on how arguments are evaluated. But so it has a lot of potential, not just in our individual interactions with patients, but across the board, thinking about public health. And so it's something that's worth thinking about beyond the scope of the MCAT. And of course, you need to generally know about social networks for the MCAT, but I would be shocked if you got a question about gossip seeds. This is just for fun.
Yeah. And that is also something, like you said, can be useful and a good thing. But if that information is bad, and that can kind of spread that information a whole lot faster. And so that becomes gossip seeds could be useful or dangerous, depending on the scenario.
Social media is a great example.
Yeah. I have seen some like interesting CARS passages actually on this topic before. And connecting like the spread of information and kind of like tying it to, there's a lot of research that kind of connects this to like virology and the spread of disease. And so you can kind of think about like these gossip seeds, like people who can spread information very quickly to lots of different groups. That's kind of like a super spreader from the, kind of coming at it like as disease and kind of moves. And so there's a lot of interesting research, like people are literally studying the spread of either disease or information. And there's a lot of overlap between those two research areas. And they actually like reference each other a lot in terms of their research, which is super interesting.
Yeah. Sociology has a lot of overlap with epidemiology.
Yes, absolutely. I do want to talk about like, kind of like stepping out a little bit broader from like family and kin, and going to groups, like other groups that you might consider yourself a part of, like peer groups, right? And so I want to be kind of careful here because the MCAT will use the term peer group and reference group often, and a lot of times students will get like tripped up between those two phrases. So peer groups are people that you are that are in like a similar scenario as you. Like they're in like the same kind of like level of education, or it kind of depends on what your process is, right? Like if I got a new job at this school or at this job, which makes more sense. And I was mixing two metaphors. I'm like, which one do I do? Like a freshman going into college, all the other freshmen are your peers. You get a new job, all the other people who just started with you are those peers. Later on, as you start to understand the job better, like everyone at that job becomes your peer because they're kind of all at the same level as you. And so peers are people who are in the same scenario as you, at kind of like the same level. Reference group are the people you look to figure out how to act. So like if I was somebody who wanted to be a physician, right? Like physicians would be my reference group. Like, how am I supposed to act in this scenario? It can get kind of confusing because your peer group could be your reference group, right? Like I'm just trying to act like my peers. I'm just trying to fit in which case peer and reference group overlap, but they don't have to overlap, right? And so focusing on this, like, is this people that I consider the same as me, or is this people that I'm trying to emulate? And those can overlap, but they don't have to. And so you have to be really careful with that kind of like framework. I would say if you were a medical student and you were looking at a physician, I would probably consider that more of a reference group than a peer group. Although I could see somebody saying like, oh, the healthcare community, that's my peer. Those are my peers, versus like people who work in like, construction or whatever. Like that's not my peer because we're not in the same thing. But if you ever got a question about that, where there's kind of a difference in level that's very clear in how they're phrasing this, like you're a first year medical student, what are the physicians? Like there's a difference there in that. So I would lean more towards reference group would be how I would refer to the physicians in that case. Although absolutely, I consider like the whole healthcare team as a team and kind of working together. Not that like the med students are a lower tier people or class, although sometimes it feels like it when you're in the system.
Medicine is a mess of hierarchy. To some extent, there is, if you think about medical students and physicians, to some extent, right, in terms of knowledge, that makes sense. But there's also that collaborative element, and I've been really blessed to have some amazing attendings and residents that I've worked with that, although they knew eons more than I did, they allowed me to think out loud and did not put me down for it. And they, gave us the space, and I say us, meaning the medical students on the team, gave us the space to actually pitch ideas, like genuinely pitch them, and they would take them into consideration. And so that didn't take away their leadership, right? Or the how we, use them as a reference group. It did not make them peers at the same level, but it just made for more collaborative, better learning environment. So I just want to encourage those of you that are listening, when you become physicians, make sure to apply that same principle to the med students you're working with and also to the rest of your coworkers. Making sure that you're applying that principle to the nurses that you work with the physician assistants, the PAs that you're working with, everyone on the team, because that makes for a healthier and more durable connection and relationship. And since we're talking about relationships today, just wanted to throw that out there. I think it's important.
Yeah, I do feel like that's gotten generally better over the last couple of decades, where like the hierarchy and like has, I don't want to say broken down because there is a very clear hierarchy, but like there's like the first year med student is never going to order around the physician, which is honestly good.
Never.
That's not how it should be.
Exactly.
But like the like animosity or hazing or things like that, like are holding lower in the hierarchy to impossible standards or requests that are straight up impossible, like working 140 hours in a week.
Nope.
That, I will be clear, that has not gone away completely, but it has gotten better. And I hope that the people listening to this will continue to kind of push that in the right direction. But I feel like we're getting super sucked into like the structure of hospitals and things like that.
Yeah. So while the physicians might be your reference group, other med students might be your peers, you also have strength of connections. So it's not just the type of connections, but the strength of connections that we have. And so that's where primary and secondary groups can be very helpful for classifying and understanding the relationships that we have. So you walk into the hospital and there are other medical students on the team. Maybe you met them first year, but didn't really interact with them a whole lot. And now you guys are on this team together. The connection that you guys have is not particularly close, right? It's not particularly strong. And this is going to be a secondary group for you because it has those weaker, more transient, situational connections. Whereas in the example that you gave, Phil, that friend that you really went through it with medical school, and at this point, you guys have been friends for a really long time and they're basically family. Although they started as part of your secondary group, they are now part of your primary group.
Yeah.
And so the primary group often is going to be the folks that you start your life with, but because these are going to be very strong long-term connections. So you think about family members, any of the definitions that we gave earlier apply. And so these are those really intense, stronger connections. They're often lifelong, but they're not always lifelong. Someone can start as part of that secondary group and become or move into that primary group. Not everyone will, though, right? Because this primary group inherently is smaller than your secondary group. The people that you have these stronger social connections to, that you might go to for advice and help, and you've known each other for years, has to be smaller than all the people you're going to have contact with. And so I definitely have friends that have moved from a secondary group to primary for me, and also family members that are very much still part of my primary group. So two important types of classifications that account for strength, longevity, intensity of connection, not just situational.
Yeah. You can also have things moving in the other direction, like primary, secondary. Like if you were very close with your family growing up, but like as you got older, you realized like, oh, a lot of those relationships were not healthy. And there were kind of problems there. I'm like, I'm not trying to cut my family out completely. Like I still want to kind of like have some communication with them, but I don't consider them really my primary group in that case. I think that for me, like, how do I define where's the line between primary and secondary? Like that gets kind of blurry, right? Like it's very clear, like, oh, this one classmate who I haven't ever talked to and this classmate that I spend every holiday with, like that's very clear. But what about the classmate that I see, like hang out with like once a month? So like I see them at a party or something like that, like, and we always talk and we know what's going on with each other's lives. Like where does that fit in? For me, I think the clearest way to tell between a primary and secondary is the thing that connects you. If that thing went away, would you still be with that person? So like a coworker, like you might have a coworker that you're really friendly with, but if all of a sudden you didn't work at that place anymore, would you still be interacting with that person? If the answer is yes, like I would be going out of my way to interact specifically with this person, even if the connector between us dropped, then that's probably more of a primary group. If it's somebody who like I see at work all the time, but like if I lost my job, I would never talk to them again. Like that would probably be more of a secondary group instead. I think that's one of the trickier things with the primary and secondary.
And that's where that situational component of the secondary group is why it's part of how we think about it,
right?
Because there can be that blurring of lines. And part of what, in addition to, maybe those family members, problematic ways of thinking or acting or whatever, that can be one reason that they go from being part of your primary group to secondary. But also, if the connection was, the strength of it was situational, meaning proximity, right? That can also cause these family members who may have initially started off as part of your primary group become part of your secondary group. So I think a lot of us have family members that, when we were younger, we were close to them physically and also, emotionally. And then with time, you just don't really talk as much. In that case, you're not going to know as much about their life. And so that's where that situational component that you were talking about is helpful, because they're now going to match more that friend that maybe you're close with, but if you were no longer roommates or classmates, you just not talk to each other. And so both can be examples of secondary group, even though one you would consider family, the other you wouldn't. The connection, that strength is what matters more for this.
Yeah. And so like this like group, like how you kind of see groups and what groups am I in and that sort of thing, that connects a lot to this idea of like in-group and out-group. Like who are the people who you consider like you and who are the outsiders? This is a really interesting topic, and there's a lot of connection here by biologists trying to connect this to in-group, out-group, and like biological fitness, evolutionary fitness, and altruism, which is kind of an interesting thing. But basically, in-group are the people you consider as like you're in that group, and the out-group is outside. Generally speaking, people care more about their in-group than the out-group, right? I care more about the people that are like me, like my family, right? Like that's my in-group, or my friends, like we're in an in-group, or that sort of thing. So I care more about these people than the people on the outside. It's something that like a part of me like feels like, oh, that's terrible. Why can't I care a lot about everybody? But we kind of can't handle that as humans, right? Like imagine like if your best friend died, right? Like I know that that's a terrible scenario, right? And like that's going to have a really strong. I know you're right. This is a horror. We're taking a turn. We're swerving off the road here. But like that's going to really impact you. But like you physically won't be able to maintain that level of care about everyone in the world who dies, because people die every day across the world. And so if you were that distraught every single day, like you wouldn't be able to function as a human. And so we tend to kind of like have this in versus out. And like, these are the people that I care more about, and the outsiders I care less about. This leads to lots of conflicts and lots of things in the world, lots of blaming of other groups, right? Like it's their fault. But that's why like we're having a hard time, is because those people. And so that can lead to a lot of like nationalism and blaming. And I think that leads to a lot of strife with like sexism and racism, with like, oh, the men we're on the inside. It's all women and they're on the outside. They're different. We don't care as much about them. Like that viewpoint is this in versus out. And so a part of me understands why we can't care as much about everyone, but I also understand that viewpoint leads to conflict and leads to problems. And so it's also something really interesting, looking at the size of somebody's in-group versus out-group, right? Like there are people out there who like, I only care about what happens to me and my family. Like anything, like I will steal from other people, and that will help my family, because I don't care about the others, the outsiders. I care about the insiders. So if I steal from somebody and then I get to buy stuff for my family, like that's a good thing because it's helping the in-group. But different people, the size of their in-group is different. And I really, really strive to make my in-group as big as I possibly can, right? I want to feel compassion and empathy for people in other countries, right? When there's war or famine or things like that, I want to do that. There is a biological push against that. And so sometimes I think it's people need to take spend like effort to try to make sure and kind of like see the world through other people's eyes and try to include them in your viewpoint. But honestly, this in-group, out-group stuff, there's so much to talk about, because I feel like so much of the world can be understood through looking at in versus out.
Yeah. As before responding to that, as you were talking, my mind was engaging in spreading activation, a term that you guys should know for the MCAT. And basically this one topic lit up a bunch of other topics that we have talked about in the podcast before, really long time ago: morality and whether or not it's okay to steal. That is probably something we should do again. Biases and how we interpret the actions of others versus our own actions. And so these are spin-offs that y'all can start thinking about, reading into, that you still need to know for the MCAT. We just don't have time to talk about in this, and capacity to talk about in this podcast episode. But yeah, there's a very strong philosophical tie between a lot of what we do in sociology and how we behave, right? And whether how we behave is the best way to behave or not. And with this in-group, like you're pointing out, it's about seeing some kind of connection, seeing some kind of similarity, a point of caring. It's important to note that someone can be a part of your in-group, even if they are not part of your primary group.
Yes.
And so I think that's important because you can get a question, right? And they may focus it on caring, right? Or wanting good for some group. You will probably see something about primary group as one of the answer choices and in group, right? But there's a difference between them. And so some kind of similarity, caring, that is in group. So seeing that these are outsiders, right? And there's a difference, there's space and disconnect, that's out group. And so in versus out, hopefully is clear, but just want to specify that someone can be either primary or secondary group and also your in group.
Yeah.
I would not go for out group.
Yeah.
You've had any of those scenarios.
Yeah.
I'm just going to toss that out there.
Yeah. I think like everybody listening to this, I consider anybody in the medical field as an in group. Like for me, and it's like when somebody says like, oh, I want to be a physician or something, I immediately like, yeah, I'm one of you, like you're one of me, like we got this, right? Like, so there's a lot more implicit kind of trust within those relationships. And that's also can lead to like distrust of like people who are in the out group sort of thing. But you're right. There's so many things that spin off of this and connect to this. And this in versus out, personally, I think leads to a lot of the problems in the world where it's like, you know, kind of like us versus them mentality, which I think is a false dichotomy. Like it isn't like us versus them all the time. But because people see it that way, it leads to kind of coldness and not caring about other groups. And that can lead to a lot of harm.
Yeah. I'm going to bring us back to the MCAT because we can go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yep.
That. But you mentioned something else that is important for the MCAT and the discussion of groups. You talked about group size. And so you talked about how you try and make your in-group as large as possible, but we don't have the capacity to have the same degree of care, the same amount of care and that intense connection with everyone within our in-group. The size of the group that you're thinking about can also impact its stability. And we're not going to talk about decision-making. That's a whole other topic, that the size of the group and
like thinking, group polarization and all of those terms. Yeah.
Yeah. Also things you need to know. But there's a group can technically just be two people, which is not something that we typically think about. Normally we think of groups and it's, 5, 6, bigger. But a dyad or a group of two people also constitutes a group for our purposes. And this is going to be a really intense connection because it's just the two of y'all, right? In this group. So it's a very strong tie. You can also have a group of 3, and that's a triad. Now, while the connections may not be quite as intense in a triad, they definitely can still be intense. A triad is technically more stable than a dyad. Because in a dyad, what happens, this group of 2, what happens when y'all are in conflict? There's no one to be able to take that more neutral stance or that third-party stance and to mediate. Whereas in a triad, it's possible for one of the 3 members to say, okay, let's come back. Let's think this through. And so a triad can be and will be more stable than a dyad. So the size of the group can improve stability, recognizing that if the group is too large, that, can, in conversation about outgroup, and again, we're talking about groups in general, so this does not have to be an in-group. When we're talking about the size, it can be for different groups. But, there's a balancing act to be had with the size of the group and the stability. You don't want, for making decisions, you don't want a group that's too tiny. You don't want a group that's too big.
Yeah. I want to be kind of clear when we talk about group size, like this isn't specifically just primary group or in group or out group, right? Like my primary like groups includes like my family and like my friends that I consider family and like foster kids. And like, there's lots of connections there between those. But like they're kind of different groups that make up my primary group. And so like if I had a best friend and it was just me and him, like there's going to be a scenario where we disagree on something. And if we both have strong feelings, like that leads to this sort of conflict. Now, if there's a group of me and two friends and we're a group, what happens is there's no way for us to get like an even split, right? Either it's one-on-one and there's a mediator who's going to be like de-escalating things, or it's two-on-one. And if I'm the one and they're both feeling the same thing, like I'm gonna back down because like both of them feel this way. And so like maybe I'm in the wrong here. But if it's just me and my one friend, I'm like, no, I think you're wrong. Like I'm not wrong, you're wrong. But then like that, so that's why often like evenly sized groups can fracture. And having an odd size tends to be more stable. Now, like you mentioned, like the size matters, right? Like if I had a group of best friends and there was 170 of us, like that doesn't make sense, right? That's not best friends, right? Because like you can't have that strong of connection with that many people. And so I would say generally the bigger the group, the weaker the connections get. I think you can have a really strong connection with 4 or 5 people and that's like no problem. 40 or 50, it's just impossible because there's not enough time in the day to like go through everything you need to have that strong connection with those people. So that's something that's a little bit tricky there.
I have a friend who's very much an extrovert, has enough ties to qualify as a gossip seed, although they are not a gossiper. I will say that. So the name is a bit of a misnomer there. But at one point they told me they took a little bit longer than usual to respond. I was like, hey, are you okay? I know you've been going through a lot. And they said, I just have so many texts from friends and I'm trying to figure out who to respond to first. Because this is not their primary group, right? Essentially, they're deciding, okay, who's in my primary group that I need to respond to? And within that primary group, who's more okay with me taking longer to respond, right? Because they're accounting for that. And so they know that there are other friends that if they don't respond soon enough, they're going to be upset that are part of their primary group. They know that I'm also sometimes really bad at texting. And so I'm just going to be like, just making sure you're okay. But other than that, we're chill.
I had a friend in college who was very clear. He's like, listen, I only really have room in my life for 5 good friends. And like, so whenever I meet new people, I decide like, is this somebody who I might want to put into that group or is it not somebody I want to put in that group? And he's like, I got 4 people. I'm holding out for someone with a boat. Like I need my boat friend. And so I'm just holding out for that one person. And that just like cracked me up. And I'm thinking about that now. Like there is a limit to the size. And so maybe everyone out there is just holding out for their boat friend because very clearly having a boat friend is better than having a boat, right? Like I just want a friend I can borrow their boat. I don't want to actually have a boat myself and deal with maintenance and problems and things like that.
Oh my goodness. Low-key, I kind of get where that friend is coming from.
I do too. I didn't then, but I do now.
Yeah. And I think for me, this is a combination of being an introvert and also having so many things going on in my life at the same time. We didn't get to talk about roles. We're going to have to talk about that at another time. But like, I don't have the capacity to be intensely invested in 20 friends. Like I don't have the time. I will feel bad if I do not get to someone fast enough. And so my primary group is significantly smaller than some of my other friends because they have the capacity to bring in people, to bring in friends that are essentially family, right? Because they have those really strong, very long-lasting ties. So for me, that's not the case. For me, my primary group is going to be smaller, even though my in-group or my peer group might be the same size in total, right, as whatever their total is. And so it's worth considering that. I also really quickly want to point out, we talked about conflict. I want to recognize that people have very different responses to conflict sometimes. In one of our classes, we did our conflict tendencies. We did this online test, survey, assessment, whatever it's called. And it gave us colors. We all were placed into 3 different colors and combinations of colors based on how we approach conflict. And so you mentioned that someone might back down if there are 2 friends against one. Recognize that may not always be the case. Yeah. Some people might push even harder because their first response to conflict is, I need to win. Some people are going to back down. Maybe they want to preserve the relationship more than winning the conflict. There are going to be some people that take a step back and want to analyze before they get back into that conflict. But either way, there is still a greater potential for stability in that group compared to a group of 2.
Yeah. I do think also what you're talking about, just like not having enough time and room, I think that generally speaking, that probably gets harder the farther you go down the medicine path, because you get so many more kind of requirements on your time. And so my groups got smaller as I went through that, just because I had less time for those things. Now, that might be why I have such strong connections with all my friends in med school, because my peer groups got smaller, and that kind of galvanizes and like, okay, instead of having like, 15 or 20 friends that I hang out regularly in different circles, now there's like 4. And us 4, like, we have to carve out time for each other, and it's so hard and critical, and I don't have time for everyone, but these I do. I also think that that's also why friend groups, it tends to get harder to make friends as you get older, just because you have extra requirements on your time. I do think, though, that while that like friend group might be shrinking, you might be growing your primary group, but I want to say more vertically, like with like kids and like kids' friends. And like all of a sudden, like if I have a kid and my kid is a best friend, like who is around every day for 5 years, I'm like, I have a very strong relationship with that person, even though like that isn't like my primary like best friend. Like it's my kid's best friend. It's like my group can grow, maybe not horizontally. I feel like when you're younger, a lot of your friends are your peers. And so my primary group has grown to not necessarily peers, but more kind of outside of that. And so maybe my primary group has not necessarily shrunk. It's just gotten skinnier and taller, if that makes sense. It's less spreading through the peer group, but more at like vertical through different groups.
Yeah. And that resonates so much. For me, I've mentioned him, I've mentioned him a couple times, my nephew is now part of my primary group, whether he likes it or not.
Yes. Whether he's aware or not of it.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely not. He's not at the age where he's aware, although I was really excited because not that long ago, I called my brother to FaceTime and to video chat, and I believe it was actually on my nephew's birthday. And I said his name, and for whatever reason, I tend to, the first time I call his name, I tend to do it in like a sing-songy voice. He was standing up and playing with some blocks. He turned around, so I was like, he recognizes my voice.
Yeah. That, I feel like, is the perfect way to end the episode on family and togetherness, much better than the jaunt I took in the middle. Let's bring this back to like family and togetherness. I do want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. But also, I know, Azaii, you have something you wanted to kind of talk about. It's also, we both want to talk about this, but I'm going to let you take it, Azaii, because...
Yeah.
Just because.
So we love getting to interact with you guys. We want more of that interaction, and we haven't done it in a really long time. So we're going to do another Ask Me Anything episode. And so we want your questions. So there are a couple of different ways that you can send us your questions. And one of them is at the podcast@jackwestin.com email. We do get those emails, even though we do not always respond. And so we do open them and look at them. And then if you're listening on Spotify or watching on Spotify, there is a Q&A, and you can ask us, tell us what you think about this episode. Send us your questions there. And so we'll know to look for questions there. As always, YouTube allows comments. And so we encourage you to reach out to us. We would love to answer your questions. And we're planning to do it around Christmas time. Don't hold us exactly to that, but that's our plan-ish.
Yeah.
So send us your questions. We want to be able to answer them.
Yeah, because you are part of our group. You're part of our in-group, and we love the interaction. It's kind of weird because I feel like with like kind of like podcasts and stuff like that, it's sometimes an imbalanced interaction where we are giving information but not getting as much. And I love hearing from students and kind of like, what things can we help you with? What things are the things you have questions about? What things are the things you're curious of? Just because, I about said we're you from the future, but you guys probably won't be exactly like us, which is probably good. But we have kind of like gone through some things that you may have some questions about.
No, we're gossip seeds.
I know we are gossip seeds. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
You guys make us gossip seeds in our connections. Really quickly. So that means you guys can ask questions not just about the MCAT. You can ask us questions about our MCAT studying experience, about our med school experience. In my case, I'm happy to talk about also the public health experience and pausing med school with that. Also, just anything you want to ask, we will do our best to answer. So virtually, no topic off limit. I wanted to add that caveat. But thank you so much for listening, y'all.